All right, hello and welcome to Between the Liars with Ryan, Josh,
Hello, hello, hello.
Austin,
Hey, everybody.
and we are missing Marcelo today. Life happens. Welcome to the behind-the-scenes version of this broadcast. Today we're going to cover the Right to Repair Act as well as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Before that, though, I think we have a few announcements that we'd like to cover.
All right, I'll kick us off with announcements today. So it looks like you guys need to follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and of course YouTube. So just come and like our pages, come and subscribe so you can keep up with everything that we're doing here at Between the Liars.
And the reason you're going to do that is because so you won't miss out on live streams and videos just like this one. We're going to try to have these as often as we can. We're all kind of busy, and we try to get as much time into this as we each can. But nonetheless, there's sometimes scheduling conflicts. See Marcelo not being able to be here right now with us. So we'll try to, again, as often as we can here at noon Central. Join so we can respond to your comments and interact with you all. And then plus that might, bring on more interesting conversations and view that you all have. The next announcement that we have is we're going to continue to plug our merch designed by Monica Zadra and the Humble Bee Studio. It's fantastic stuff. It's all of our logos, all of the logo you see behind us right now and the images on the podcast and Spotify, all of that stuff. We're so appreciative to have it. And it's great work. And if you all want some of it, you can come and get it. And Austin's going to tell you how you can go about doing that in a giveaway.
Surprise, free stuff. So we're going to be having some giveaways through our social media. So please go and like our Facebook. Again, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, sub to our YouTube channel, DM us that you've done those things. And the first 5 will receive a free sticker. And I think you saw Ryan hold them up. They are there. They exist physically. They are beautiful, having our logo on them, and they will look great on your laptop, on your Yeti, anywhere you want to put them. Put them on your car, put them on your arm. I don't care. They're going to look great anywhere.
So if you're watching this live, you will be aware that Austin is not with us. If you're listening to it on the podcast, you will not be. This is actually not the first time that we've had to edit someone in post-production.
That's the wrong person who's missing here, Ryan.
Marcelo, sorry. Thank you. Good catch.
Where am I?
I'm just so used to Austin being the one that's missing.
Guilty as charged.
So, all right. So before we jump into today's topics, if you've kept up with the news, you should know that Congress is set to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill as well as the Build Back Better package, kind of that human infrastructure, which we covered on a previous episode. And in that previous episode, we wound up making a prediction on how we thought that would be going. So far, my prediction is holding true. Manchin and Sinema, one of the two, if not both, in my opinion, will be the ones that are holding up this package since they're trying to push them through at the same time instead of taking individual votes. I don't see this actually happening. I think the more progressive wing is going to have to cave, or else they're going to bear the brunt of the government shutdown. That is my projection. We'll touch more on that next week. What do you two think?
I think Christian Sinema is in real danger of getting primaried. There's already been significant funds being raised. There are political action committees that spent money on her campaign and ads for her that have now kind of switched their opinions, saying, if you're gonna not back the effort to undo the filibuster to get these deals done, we're not going to be supporting you, and we will support your primary opponent. So I think Joe Manchin is in a significantly safer bet, and I think the context of West Virginia means he plays that a bit more conservative because he's in West Virginia. I don't think that's true for Christian Sinema out in Arizona, which is by the year becoming more and more of a Democratic stronghold. So I definitely expect stronger progressive pushback on her.
So I think as Ryan had mentioned, we addressed this. It's been a couple weeks, if I'm not mistaken. But just to reiterate, if I'm remembering correctly, it's $3.5 trillion and well over 2,000 pages. And there's not a single senator who has read through it. Not a single member of government has read through this whole thing, which just makes me sick. It really turns my stomach. So I can say what I hope happens. I hope it doesn't pass explicitly in its current form. And I hope that legislation like this stops dead in its tracks, because we can't have this and have a functioning nation afterwards. Now, as to what will happen, I really think Joe Manchin has his constituents to think about. I think if he passes something like this, there will be a reckoning for his own seat. I don't know. I don't see it passing in its current form.
And we'll drop Marcelo's thoughts right here, and then we'll kick it over to Josh to bring us into the right to repair. Tell us about it, Josh.
So, right to repair. This is a bit of a multifaceted idea. The main thesis of it is that if you buy electronic item, or reasonably, if you buy anything at all, that you own that item now, and largely it's yours to do with as you please. You're free to modify it, take it apart, destroy it. That may terminate some warranty. That may da 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 da. But fundamentally, it's yours, and you should be able to do things to it. So, right to repair is a kind of a slogan for a movement to address a trend in recent technology that it's making more integrated. You're not able to replace components inside of laptops, and especially we're not able to replace our batteries on our smartphones anymore if you ever were in the first place. And there's companies taking actions that really restrict the ability for third parties to work on devices, to access replacement parts, and sometimes going out of their way to intentionally sabotage a device after it has been worked on by a third party. And so then that's just like directly harmful to consumer and contributes to a lot of electronic waste, and there are parts of it. So how the government is right now working on adjusting this is President Biden has issued an executive order asking the Federal Trade Commission to look at essentially how do they how the executive government enacts law and enforces it. If Congress will pass a law, then the executive department responsible for carrying out the law is going to interpret and pass a rule or create a rule. And so President Biden is asking the Federal Trade Commission to create these rules about device compatibility and device repairability through executive order. There's also been action taken in individual states such as Massachusetts, of where they target explicitly the auto industry, trying to establish standardized components and standardized access to those components to allow repair shops to work on manufacturers. That law is actually pending in a lawsuit by most of the global automakers have joined in this collective to sue this. Another example of this is like standardization. Over in the European Union, they're trying to force Apple to get rid of the Lightning charger on their iPhone. And I will say personally, Apple, if anyone possibly hears this, you have replaced the Lightning port on every single device but your iPhone. It's gone off the iPad now. I guess so. Like, what's going on here? Just do it. Just do it. Get rid of the Lightning. It's so useless. Please. So people can't access and repair their devices, and it's been a trend in technology that's getting worse. Now, we're going to have Austin give us a couple of examples, then we'll really get into some of the more nitty-gritty parts of what I kind of mentioned in the overview.
Yeah, so for anyone out there listening that thinks the Right to Repair Act or this whole concept doesn't really hit home with them, as Josh mentioned, you might even be watching on a device that is impacted by Right to Repair, namely with the iPhone Lightning charger. So manufacturers going from standard USB, USB 2, now we have USB-C on a lot of devices that aren't proprietary Apple devices. There are market improvements in performance and whatnot. USB-C versus USB Lightning. As far as I'm aware, I'm not a big Apple guy, so I'm not big on these specifications, but that seems to be a hit to, basically you have to buy our thing, otherwise you can't use our thing. This is exactly the heart of what we're getting at. We want people, it would be preferable to have some degree of modularity or at least a strong third-party market. Other examples of this would be intentionally complex designs where you have proprietary screws when a normal screw would probably work just fine. Some components, think Josh mentioned earlier, onboard batteries that are soldered in, like the most recent smartphone that I purchased. I'm honestly, it's been like 5 years. I have a Samsung S8 Plus. I'm living in the Stone Ages, but it's great. My phone prior to that was a Nokia smartphone. For those of you that remember those bricks, I was able to replace the battery when it went dead, which is great. My Samsung, I am not going to crack this thing open. I am not brave enough to, because it is not as user-friendly to replace things on. Let's see. There's the issue of third-party parts not being available and third-party repair programs being inhibited by manufacturers, such as what Apple does. In some cases, they actually put limitations on what sort of operations can be performed on some of their products by contracts with third parties. And a weird situation that we had come up with was also John Deere limiting diagnostic software scans to only their certified technicians. You can't go to the local lawnmower guy, which, weird enough, we have one of those at White House due to works on lawnmowers, which is really great. We've had him do some work in the past. But he wouldn't have the software to scan a John Deere lawnmower. They said they were going to provide the information to be able to do that kind of work back in 2018, but they never did. So this kind of illustrates the issues with some of these companies. Even if people are chasing them on this, sometimes they just don't really comply. Killing the third market makes their products, in my opinion, less viable an option because you can't actually fix them yourself. But it seems that a lot of people would just prefer to buy a new one rather than repair. Replacement seems to be more of an option, which is not the best thing.
The John Deere example you brought up, kind of the industrialized farming, hits home a lot closer for me now that I'm out in the Midwest, North Dakota, Minnesota area, right? Because everybody does farming. That's one of their major industries out here. And I agree with everything that was said. And I think one additional thing, or just to kind of play the devil's advocate and throw this out here, I know one of the main concerns with allowing kind of this right to repair to happen is you could have the person who is qualified, like Austin mentioned, to fix things. You also have third parties who are not. And if I'm John Deere and I am, going to put a warranty on a product, I certainly wouldn't want to be held responsible to fix something that someone else messed up. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to be one of the big pushbacks towards this, is that the engineers and like the corporations are concerned that it might hold them liable for something that they didn't necessarily do, unless there's like a clause that protects them.
I imagine they would probably be protected if they did like from a third party repair. But you can also see from their perspective, take Tesla. Tesla does not like other people touching their cars, especially anything to do with the onboard circuitry. You basically come back to the dealership to get your Tesla repaired or serviced at all. And that's the way they want to do it. And as we see more and more kind of very complicated safety systems built into cars, built into self-driving cars, there is that greater concern of, here is something our engineering team has worked on for, a decade, and it is very precisely tuned for these very specific instances, and they can get modified and changed. And the engineers and the companies are worried about that, especially when it comes to accessing like the software and fiddling around with the different mechanisms and controls. Apple also uses this safety argument. They're like, if someone doesn't do the battery replacement right, you could get a bad connection and it could cause a short and then cause a fire. Or if this person is not buying Apple authorized batteries to replace, and they're not buying them from us here at Apple, we don't know how good of a quality of a battery that's going to be, or if that's going to be safe to put in the phone. Therefore, we will only cover the warranty at an Apple certified, location using an Apple certified part, because that's the only way we can say we know it's safe for the consumer. So there is a little bit to be said about why they want some of their control when it does come down to safety aspects of it. However, that also just is a broader look at consumer electronic production regulation and control. Like, rather than there might be a bad battery thrown in there, and so that might cause the device to go wrong later. Well, let's focus on, why are there bad batteries available to purchase, or target the quality control there, or some other way.
Well,
But
until recently, Apple was deliberately sabotaging their stuff, which they were dumb enough to come out and admit, right? Like, I still have the iPhone 7. That is how far behind the times I am right now, because I don't want to pay for an upgrade. I don't want more payments on a phone. I was happy with it, but every time they release a new software update, it is killing it to the point that I can't run Spotify and open another app, period, because it shorts them both out, and then my phone pretty much freezes. I think I'm one or two repairs away from being forced to go into their specific traders, or if I try to fix it, their specific people to fix it. At this point, you're better off just upgrading it.
Is that planned obsolescence? I think the term is.
I think that's right.
So it's planned obsolescence, but there is something about, especially with our phones, as they progress throughout their lifetimes, they keep getting software updates. This is especially true for iPhones. And so the software keeps getting more complicated because Apple's designing the software for phones that have better processors. And then all of the app developers go, oh, the phones are getting faster processors, so it's okay if our apps, use more system resources. And so it's kind of planned obsolescence, but it's also kind of both the progression of assumption on the operating system and the app developers of the new device will also contributes to slowing older devices down. However, I will say on the note of Apple sabotaging their devices, I want to say this was first observed in the iPhone 12, that if you took an iPhone 12 and you took two Apple iPhone 12s, you took them both, identical make and model iPhones, took the backs off, disconnected the camera unit, and then exchanged the camera unit between the two devices, and did everything back, put the device back together, powered it on. The camera would no longer work because Apple had programmed a software identification on the camera and on the motherboard. So if a third-party camera was ever used, or the camera that you didn't go into the firmware of the motherboard for the iPhone, you would have to change the identifier there to use a new camera, which is something only Apple could do. Meaning, even though it's possible to take off the camera and put it in, it was an easy repair for this person, it would not let the camera work because Apple restricted the software by the way they coded the device.
Not only at that point do you wind up creating monopoly on the products, you because of that, you get to charge whatever you want. So if it's a very simple repair that costs you 38 cents to replace, if Apple's the one who holds the monopoly, or John Deere's the one who holds the monopoly on the diagnosis or the ability to replace correctly, then they get to charge whatever they want for it, which then that tends to negatively impact us as the consumer, which is why, phones repairs can cost so much, or at least one of the reasons.
I'll even get another sinister take on this. And there's this line of, well, it's going to cost $400 to repair your device. But the new iPhone 13 mini is only $600. Why don't you go ahead and upgrade?
About time to upgrade.
And it's kind of like the same thing of like why the medium option exists in drinks. Oh yeah, well, I'll go ahead and get the medium. Well, the large is only 5 cents more. So yeah, well, go ahead and get the large. It's only 5 cents more. Go ahead and get the new device. It's only a few, like that's definitely a part of because at some level they do make more profit on you buying a new device than them having to service another device, which at some level is just an expense if it's a warranty service. However, it can be profitable if it actually is, because repair businesses run all the time.
So as we move towards wrapping up this section, what are kind of our thoughts on where maybe some major concerns or where we think this might go? What do you guys think on that section?
I think there's a concern from a consumer standpoint, obviously, because maybe if you don't want to spend the extra $200 to get the iPhone 13 mini, then you don't spend the $200. That's fine. But for people who are kind of on the borderline, it's nice to have the choice, but also, I don't know, you kind of have to wonder, why is it so cheap to buy the new iPhone as opposed to getting the iPhone repaired? That's a discussion for another day. But I think the biggest issue I see, it's very obviously, it seems to be consumer abuse from where I'm sitting. The other option as well, I think there's an environmental concern personally. I do think that I think there's something to be said about what used to be standard in American culture of you repair the things that you buy. You buy something for life, so to speak, and then you do what you can to keep it running. I think that's a great thing. And I think it's not only good for the person, it helps them grow in character, learning a new skill, learning how to repair and maintain something they care for. But also it's good for the environment too, in the sense that you're not getting a new iPhone every 6 months because, I don't know, you can't open Spotify and the internet at the same time or something. I don't know. I think all around it's not super great for the consumer or the space they live in.
I think my thoughts on this would be that it would be okay for them to move forward with the right to repair so long as there are enough protections carved out for the organizations who are creating and funding these, whether it be tractors or phones or whatever tech we're talking about here. As long as that's protected, I think that the intervention there is acceptable because we're allowing for the increased protection of the company while also forcing them to be more competitive with each other. And that tends to be a positive good for the consumer, meaning we don't have to be forced to upgrade, or we don't have to go to only one specific place to get the repair that we're needing. Josh?
I think beyond there's the concerns of, in my opinion, of even of like the idea of device ownership. I think as even we've seen more software move into the subscription type service, or even the video game industry where you see games as a service, and where you're never quite in a state of ownership, but in this like continual state of payment for. And in some way, monopolizing repairs does that to a physical item, that you're in this constant state of paying for the item throughout its lifetime to a singular company, same as a like subscription. But I think so beyond that kind of dystopian, like only ever kind of leasing things and not having true ownership over a device, I think, as we said before, the grandest concern for me about right to repair is about how we're being responsible of our production of these machines and our use of them, and really how we maximize the benefit we get from these computers and stuff and advanced technologies we make. Because for a processor that could, if had the rest of its components serviced around it and could have its life extended by 5 or 6 years, that could be really good. And especially when you look at our modern computer crisis we're going through, where we don't have enough silicon wafers to make all of the processors that we need, being able to have a device serviceable that the user can maintain it, because right now it can actually be hard to replace parts of your computer. So having your device repairable so that you don't have to be put in that situation and you don't have to let things go to waste. I also think having international standards on electronics is a massive point of really importance for the international community. Things with like charging cables. This also gets into really specific things about computers, but like with it, there's like power supplies and motherboards, and there are some really terrible things the companies like Dell and HP and Lenovo do to their computers and the laptops, that they functionally make all of these, gold, silver, silicon CPUs, one-time use electronics that will live for 4 or 5 years and then die, and go into a landfill, when otherwise that device could have been used for 10 to 15 years probably, if cared for and upgraded along the way, and was modular enough to be upgraded. And so as a point of just reduce is great. It's really important for the environment, and just important not to let things go to waste unnecessarily. Like, why are we it's not good to throw away a perfectly good processor if we don't have to. So obviously this was kind of an echo chamber from us, but I will also say that this will just be one of my particular points of advocacy, because I do think when there are like such very basic things like consumer rights like this, and it's a very clear environmental win, it's a very clear consumer win, and so it's an important cause, and it's picking up momentum at the federal and state level. And I'm obviously very pro right to repair in general.
I think that's a good segue to our Section 230 discussion, and we will be sure in our hot takes to tie back. We'll address both of these. So any final thoughts on that in post-production? We'll drop Marcelo's thoughts in here, because I am curious if he'll have any kind of dissenting opinions. I feel like he'll pretty much be on board with us here. But let's talk about Section 230. There's a few misconceptions about what this is that I'd like to clear up. And if you haven't heard anything about this, it's a great time to hopefully learn some things. And then we'll dive into the discussion of what's going on, why might this be important. But in essence, Section 230 is a clause of the Communications Decency Act, and it is specifically designed to protect free speech online. It's kind of a modernization of the First Amendment privileges. What it specifically states is that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. What this means is that if you were to come on our YouTube page, Facebook page, what have you, we would not be held legally responsible for what you say, because it is not our opinions. What we could be held responsible for is what we say in these videos, theoretically, if we were to say something with like slander, etc., that can be legally prosecuted. The misconception that takes place around 2:30 is that I've heard before, and I think I've even mistakenly said in the past, that it kind of separates a publisher from an editor, like a platform from the editor. That's not actually true. All it does is it generalizes that you, as a person starting a thread of any kind that people might respond to, in kind of the snowball that the internet happens to produce, you are not held responsible for that. So the important thing for this, as we look at big tech, right? So you've kind of got this big tech monopoly that takes place. You've got the big players, the power players. You've got Google, you've got YouTube, you've got Facebook, you've got Twitter, you've got Amazon. Have I missed anybody in those major players? I don't think so. But anyway, they
the parent company of TikTok, it's not Huawei. That's the technology company. But the big social media conglomerate in China. I forget its exact name, but
Tencent, is that it? Or no, ByteDance. Tencent is a tech company.
Yeah, Tencent is another one of the is an entertainment conglomerate. But yeah,
ByteDance is the TikTok parent company.
Is the kind of their social media conglomerate.
Okay, so one of the main protections, in addition to protecting you from being held responsible, is that you also you are immune from civil liabilities for information service providers that remove or restrict content from their services that they deem, and this is quoted, obscene, lewd, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable. So it also doesn't just say that you have to just leave your thread open. You can moderate the content, and that is what we see with like the fact checkers and Facebook and YouTube choosing to downgrade or upgrade content. Technically, they're still protected under Section 230. Most of the complaints that I've heard surrounding Section 230, and I've heard this from both sides of the political aisle, is that the content is selectively curated to skew towards a political side. And that is protected in the current Section 230 under the phrase otherwise objectionable. Because if it's misinformation and I can argue that such and such harm down the road exists because of that, well, now that's objectionable, so I can remove that. So that has kind of set the stage for what Section 230 is. I'll kick it over to you guys to kind of talk where you'd like about that.
So I'll say one of the hard parts of even managing this social media debate is because they feel like they're these big public forums where we all come together and have our discourse, and it's even this like somehow glorified Habermasian public sphere realized. I know none of that made sense. It was for my own but they're not. They're playgrounds of private corporations. And at some level, when we talk about wanting to control and moderate how they present partisan information from a governmental level, we're really stepping into a ground of policing a private company in a very unique way, because we haven't ever had technology like this before. So, it would be in a unique way. But nonetheless, this is, we used to, we used to have like what we called the fairness standard for the broadcast television. Got disappeared under Ronald Reagan, but I don't even think that even remotely ties in here. But I do think there's kind of this weird balance of how do we moderate what essentially has become these big open forms of information sharing and how the nation communicates with itself that are just private companies. And I think that raises the question of, do we really realistically want these private companies? Or even as dystopian as this sounds, would a kind of government type social media where these discourses could happen that weren't going to be censored and, have your First Amendment protected be something, wanted? Because that is, or, how to moderate these, not only from internally, but externally, I think is a really hard question.
Austin, what are your thoughts on this?
I think Josh raises a really good point, especially toward the end there. Having the government involved, as with most things, that seems to be a trend in a lot of the opinions that I share. I really don't know how much of a benefit that would be. I feel like that would be the same issue. You'd just be shaking your fist at a different, nearly impossibly large entity, so to speak, because it seems that social media, these large companies like Ryan mentioned earlier, they're growing in size and power to the point that they certainly overlap many of the governments across the world, but they're getting pretty large in size, where I would argue they have more influence than our own government in a lot of affairs. Um, Now that gets into the territory also of like media versus government, who has the most influence. It's kind of a second face to media, social media, who has the most influence. Um, it is a very tricky issue because there is an obvious problem, but the solution is not so clear cut. I don't know. I'd love to explore that and hear some more opinions from you guys throughout this talk.
So I'll bring up some of the, I guess, the larger overarching things we've seen. This really came to a head once former President Donald Trump was kicked off of Twitter/Facebook and was silenced at the violation of the guidelines from Twitter. And before that, when we were coming up to the 2020 election, the New York Post had attempted to share and had tweeted out some things about the Hunter Biden story that had broken, and it was pretty much immediately shut down by Twitter and Facebook. And I think those were the only two that really did anything about it, to my knowledge. But two of the main social media platforms, and they unilaterally shut down one of the oldest medias that we've had. The New York Post has been around for 200 years, 200 plus years, dating back to close to the time of the founding fathers. And we see that Facebook and Twitter just shut them down. Twitter then kind of held them for ransom and said, as long as you delete these tweets, which we've deemed to be like factually irrelevant or however they had surrounded those, then you'll be okay. And so then they kind of did this PR campaign because of all the backlash and said, no, we haven't silenced them. We're just, once they take down those tweets, they'll be fine. And so they have then held, in a sense, hostage what was supposed to be the unbiased publication of the news cycle to the people, and requiring them, in a sense, to take those down. That, because of the standards that they just didn't produce for violation of community guidelines, at that point, we didn't even know if it was misinformation or disinformation. It was assumed by the big tech to be that. But they hadn't actually set those standards. To me, the troubling part of that is that they unilaterally did that. Setting aside for this moment whether that was true, whether that was politically driven, the fact that they could unilaterally shut that down preemptively, to me, is rather troubling, especially since if you want news, most people do go to Twitter at this point.
I think that really does. You brought it up during what you were saying right there, Ryan. The issue of unclear standards. I'm really big into YouTube. I spend way more time on YouTube than I should spend on YouTube, but not just political content creators or not just cultural commentators, but like gaming channels, art channels, fashion channels. I mean, if you spend any time on YouTube, you've probably come across people that are complaining about getting arbitrarily getting one of their 3 strikes before their channel, potentially their livelihood, is taken away from them with no cause and no real choice of recourse. Because a lot, again, this is anecdotal from watching different YouTube channels, but a lot of them say like, hey, I've sent to whatever safety team they have that is going through all these channels and content and skimming through them and, trying to get emails say, hey, you have wrongly struck my video down, to no response and no avail. I think a lot of the issue with some of these Section 230 things comes from a lack of understanding from these private companies. Like, what are your standards? Are they set in stone? Are they hard and fast? Can we get these set in stone so that we'll know what is acceptable, what is not acceptable? Because it seems there's enough of a gray area where there are people in these companies that can kind of arbitrarily strike people down whenever they want. That doesn't seem like a good thing.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, and obviously we talk at the point like, we call them oligarchs. We talk about like the tech monopoly. We talk, and I think all of us would agree that a large part of this would be solved by dissolving these companies into several smaller companies, not letting Facebook buy every single one of its competitors. I don't know. So there's definitely that aspect of it, but there's also even like this reflective aspect of like sometimes when they do their banning, like it works in kind of the negative way of like it's successful. So like Richard Spencer, former very prominent neo-Nazi, Mio Yiannopoulos, also this alt-white kind of white nationalist type provocateur. They have been completely removed from social media, with their various YouTube channels, everything. And they've both on different apps that will let them be there have complained how they have pretty much had their operations decimated and they can't like keep going, and they're like having to go get like a 9-to-5 job to make it, and they can't keep doing their politicking. However, they were doing really terrible things. I mean, Richard Spencer was going around talking about peaceful ethnic cleansing, and now he can't anymore. So that's a good thing. Like, so there's that line of like it can shut like things down, and that's, you know, and I think ties into the arbitrariness of like why it's problematic, of, you know, why we need like clear cut rules for different things. But when we do find something that is like actually, you know, objectionable and worthwhile to get rid of, we, you know, it is proven to be fairly effective. So it's definitely that like line of walking, and even like realistically, again, how much we're willing to force a private company to do business with someone else when they're otherwise not discriminating on the basis of a federally protected class. Obviously, we see, you know, civil rights issues come up, and so there's federally protected classes, but your political affiliation and beliefs aren't a federally protected class. So, you know, there's not real like standard for bias even holding them accountable, saying like you ban more Republicans than Democrats. The courts would go, okay, and what federal statute is that in violation of again? It's not.
You know, to me, the effectiveness is never in question, because like we saw how effective that was, because the Hunter Biden story was pretty well suppressed until about the time that they were not able to keep it under their belts anymore. Right? Like there was enough outcry that it kind of happened that they were like, you need to let the New York Post kind of do their thing. You can't unilaterally do this, and then they let him up, gave him those conditions. To me, the main problem is a sense of almost modern tech vigilantism that's taking place, because it is, in a sense, allowing these companies, who are private entities, do what they will with the traffic while claiming to be kind of just content platforms, not moderators, not curators. And this has been a very interesting conflict for me to kind of struggle with for the last several months, because I don't like government intervention on things. I think that it usually doesn't hold a place. However, I also don't like the level of unilateral power that they have when a lot of people depend on the global platforms like this to connect, to get their news, etc. And it can have dangerous ramifications because of how effective it can be. And yet I'm kind of left thinking, well, what do you do? Josh, you made a great point earlier talking about how these are private companies, and they are. And so then, like Austin mentioned earlier, you with almost surgical precision need to be very careful how you moderate these laws, because you can't just call for the downfall of Section 230, because then way more harm in that instance is done. The amount of harm that's actually been done so far is pretty minimal at this point. I mean, Josh, the people that you bring up where it's like, yes, a net good has been done because hate speech, et cetera, can't exist. That's true. However, the principle that stands that I'm uncomfortable with is the fact that they can just, like that, cut someone off, like Austin mentioned. They can downgrade. It can be more subtle, or it can be more overt, like completely cutting them off.
I really do think that's where I'm not going to say silver bullet, but that really seems to be where the biggest issue lies. Is like you mentioned at the start of this with the last phrase. What was it exactly? If I can find that again. Otherwise objectionable clause.
Yep.
When it comes to things that dictate something so central as our ability to communicate with each other, I really don't think there's not much place for vagaries when it comes to law on that. It would be very nice to see that stricken down, and maybe even 230 fleshed out a little bit more. Because for those at home who haven't really heard, it was put into effect by Congress February 8th, 1996. It has been
Internet was a baby.
Exactly. Internet was a baby. And the worst thing you would have is maybe someone had a homebrew website, or maybe AOL Instant Messenger, someone sends you something offensive. It's like the internet didn't even remotely resemble what it resembles today, nowhere near size and scope. So I think it's certainly time to readdress some of these issues. The way we communicate on the internet today is miles away from how we did back in 96. I was one. That was a long time ago.
Even to talk about the idea of making, because a lot of times, when people say, well, they are acting kind of as, this publisher, and so they don't deserve these protections, and, they should be held liable. And Ryan, you talked about kind of, you've passed over like how that would actually be so much worse. And that's kind of even what I mentioned before the show, and I said my kind of unique perspective on Section 230 is the moderation that would happen if Facebook became liable for what was on their website would be so incredibly harsh and so incredibly vicious, because Alex Jones was just found liable for the things he said around the Sandy Hook shooting and the harm he caused from that. If, and admittedly, he's still, I think he has banned from Facebook for other misinformation reasons. But if since someone can be fined liable for damages like that, if Twitter and Facebook became liable for that as well, alongside of then Alex Jones there, they would be immediately so much harsher. Over in Germany, they have hate speech laws, and so to operate in Germany, Twitter has a very specific algorithm to detect neo-Nazi, white supremacist, and otherwise hate speech inducing words. And so people have asked, okay, cool, you have this excellent content filter for really bad racism, then why don't you turn that on in the United States? And in a Vice article, in an interview with an employee, an unnamed Twitter employee, the answer was because it flags a lot of the Republican political accounts and would ban them. If Twitter was held to the standard it is to Germany as in the United States, it would ban a lot of the political discourse. If Twitter became liable for someone's manifesto that was posted on their website before they went out and committed some mass shooting, Twitter's content moderation policy would be so severe and strict. And so in some sense, that's why these companies do need this, the legal protection of not being liable for this content, as long as they're doing like good faith efforts to moderate. We see that, for like other kind of, illegal content being uploaded on their site and other things that, they do. And they put in, good faith effort to make sure things don't happen. Facebook's repeatedly been, criticized because someone has kind of, live streamed a shooting on Facebook Live. But Facebook does good faith effort to prevent that from happening. But nonetheless, that's why at some level, if these companies do become liable, the algorithms they will put in place will censor so much more than they do now.
It's interesting to observe that the ire directed towards big tech is directly correlated with whose side of the political aisle they happen to align with at the time. And that is exemplified when is it John Darcy? What's Darcy's first name? The CEO, creator of Twitter.
Jack Dorsey.
Jack Dorsey. Okay. Thank you. I know we're on your platforms. Don't censor. Jack Dorsey, when he was hauled before Congress and basically was like, what is going on with this downgrading of content? And they had YouTube, they had Twitter, they had Facebook, and they had Google hauled before them. They're like, we need to talk about this. And you had a joint force comprised of both Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans. And they were both upset with these companies, but for different reasons. And from that interview, Republicans were saying that you're downgrading and censoring too much, and Democrats were saying you're not content moderating enough. And they both, in that particular hearing, it seemed that the Republicans were more interested in more speech, including the ones that we disagree with, and the Democrats were saying the negative impact that is taking place is outweighing the free speech on that platform that's taking place. So it needs to rein it in. It's kind of those two perspectives that were taking place. Josh, again, I'll go back to what you were talking about earlier about their private companies. That's what we're dealing with. And because they're private companies, like you mentioned, this is exactly correct. If they're held liable, the crackdown will just be where private company, all of you either get on board with what we want or you're off. So it would actually be a greater restriction of free speech. And it would be a much, if you're upset with your stuff being downgraded or taken off, it'll be gone if that's what happens because it's a private company. Austin, I think you brought up a great point earlier talking about maybe one way to kind of trim away at this surgically and carefully is to make sure that we remove that final clause that says and other objectionable things, and maybe flesh that out so it's not so broad. Because right now, if my content is removed, taken away while they're a private company, they still kind of get to sit in this hole and be protected from, well, we're not an editor, we're a platform, and they get to enjoy those privileges that accompany that. But they also get to downgrade things that they might find to be objectionable off of the metrics that we mentioned before that don't seem to exist. So that's, I think that's kind of one of my big concerns with how this goes down, is that it's actually concerning to me that there's a bipartisan effort on this, because they want the same thing, but for different reasons. And depending on who's in power at that point, they will use that, if they were to gain that control, towards their political whim, or at least there's the potential for that. To me, that's more terrifying than what's potentially being downgraded or censored at this point, is if Congress is not careful in the way that they were to approach this.
Jack Dorsey. Is that a Midwestern thing? I think it's Jack Dorsey.
Oh, no, that's a Ryan thing. Ryan
Okay.
is in the Midwest. Ryan can't pronounce things. I said, instead of metonym, I said metonymy, because I was reading off my slides the other day. Speech person. I don't know what to say. That's a me thing. Thank you for the correction.
No problem.
Okay, that aside, the mispronunciation, what are your thoughts? And we'll get Marcelo's in here later, but what do you guys think on that as we kind of close this down?
I think, Josh had brought up with Twitter and what they're doing in Germany as far as having a very strong filter to catch some pretty nasty stuff. I think, obviously, we're all on the same page. You need to catch the nasty stuff. It's not good. It's not constructive. It's very bad. It's very damaging to people. It's, toxic ideology. The problem I have is I do not trust the people making these filters to actually catch the thing they are claiming they're going to make. Because for him to claim that half of what would amount to, I guess, like half of Republican talking points would go under the same filter is absolutely asinine. That is insane, that people are so out of touch that they would make filters and they would widen the scope of what would be considered white supremacy to include what less than a couple years ago was half the Overton window and half the country. That's not constructive. It's not positive. And it is a shifting of definitions it's resulting in the breakdown of social fabric we're seeing today. It's not healthy. It's not specific enough on the descriptions for what would be, toxic ideology. It's not good. So I don't know. That's just really troubling. And I don't necessarily trust a lot of these big tech people to work within the accepted definitions that would contribute to catching the most extreme ideologies. It seems like that window for extremism is shifting to the point where it's catching a lot of normal stuff. I don't know. That's kind of troubling.
Okay, early hot take. This is only a problem because we live in capitalism. So let's look at our solutions out of our current dilemma with these tech companies. We can have the government tell them how to moderate their websites, which would then imply the government is the one going to be setting the standard for truth, because if we're going to be fact checking and taking things down for misinformation, then they're going to need to be, true. And so the government's making this law. So the government was going to tell these companies what's true, and the government's going to tell these companies what to moderate. And so that's our liberal solution here. Is in our modern democracy, we'll elect our government, and then we'll have them tell those companies what to do. Or if these companies were public owned and just subjected to the will of the people, the same as our government, we could just make them do what we want them to do and moderate, or even rather come to a way to have these conversations that isn't being made in these top-down situations. These, Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey are functional, kings of the modern era and control so much, because it's not even just that they curate what they allow on the site, but then they curate, your individual timeline of what they prioritize and choose and think you want to see. And they create a psychological profile for you, and then they reinforce it by delivering you that same content.
All hail the algorithm.
All hail the algorithm. And we don't have any way of controlling and subjecting these companies to our public will without using the government as our arm to do so, because they are just these public companies. I mean, they're even private companies, but they're still public in the sense that they're on the stock market. But still, that because of these, billions upon billions that these companies are valued at, you can't, it doesn't matter. You can't buy enough stock in there for it to ever make a difference. And there's not really a vote with your dollar when half of the internet is run by Facebook at this point anyways. And so much of the broader social media integration, is just all of these different companies, whether it's Facebook and Instagram and, the United States and around most part of the world, or it's, WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook and is a major telecommunicative application in replace of a normal cell phone service throughout most of Europe, because unlike an individual cell phone, WhatsApp will work in regardless of a country. And so if you're in the EU and you're moving a lot of countries around, you don't have to worry about the cell service because you can use WhatsApp. So we need some better way to control these gigantic corporations. Even if we were to break them up, we'd still be in this problem of a very select few people are going to be decided how our discourse, our freedom of speech is moderated, and it's not going to be our government. Or if it is going to be our government, then we are going to make our government into the arbiter of truth and fact and what's approvable, and what's not approvable, and that's terrifying. So we need some control over these companies that belongs in the hands of the people. So seize the means of the production, eat the rich, and sign on, comrades.
Oh, we have a viewer. Welcome. Oh, they're gone.
I think you scared them off.
The communism
they
scared them
understand
away.
what's going on.
Bum, 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 bum,
I don't have that on here anymore. I would have played it. It would have been great.
We need it. We need it.
They came in at the hot takes. All right. So I agree with you, Josh, that, if the government is going to be the arbiter of truth, then I don't want to misrepresent, but if I'm understanding that you're saying that's terrifying, is that, they're kind of picking and choosing, because it shifts year to year. And I agree with you. That's a big problem, right? Because then at that point, what you're dealing with is the government that happens to be in control, that party that happens to be in control, and then you get what they want at that point. I think that that'll kind of bring us to a necessary balance between what's going on now and where we'd like this to go. And I wouldn't just say, yep, let the government rewrite stuff. I certainly wouldn't want this done from the executive order section. I think that we have Congress to do this for a reason. But one of the things that's troubling to me, again, going back to this idea of really no guidelines. This is exemplified in the fact that right after the January 6th insurrection, those riots that took place, Donald Trump was banned from Twitter. At the time, the sitting president of the United States was removed from Twitter. And they had kind of tied that to this idea that he would, I don't remember if it was exactly hate speech or disinformation. I think it was some combination of those. But then around the same time, you had the supreme leader of Iran was calling for the destruction and demise of Israel on Twitter. And the Twitter response, when they were basically questioned and said, well, that's pretty blatant. Donald Trump's, you admitted, was more covert, more of that whistleblowing. Where's the consistency? And what their representative said was that it doesn't violate the company's rules against hate speech. And what they indicated was that they're considered more foreign policy saber rattling, and contrasted that then with former President Donald Trump's comments. And so to me, that exemplifies that they don't really have a standard other than what they, I don't really see another conclusion other than what they politically disagree with. And to me, go ahead.
I think I understand them.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So Iran saying, I'm going to destroy Israel is a empty threat. Because no, they're not. They will not. They are afraid of I don't know, several hundred billion military industrial complex that will come down with the wrath of everything, given the opportunity in the Middle East for the drop of a hat. So that is what they're saying. They're saber rattling versus Donald Trump, who had like this borderline, and we're still arguing over like this, where we had people break into our Capitol to kidnap, to kill, to assassinate our elected members of Congress, to overturn the election, to prevent the counting of our election, and to stop the peaceful transfer of power. which is critical to America. And they were saying Donald Trump's tweets actively, actively encouraging them or stirring this pot more is a legitimate threat to the stability of our democracy versus Iran making empty threats on Twitter.
Well, while I do understand that, and there is a distinction to be made there, at the same time, the rubric or the criteria by which Twitter is downgrading or banning people from Twitter is not being held consistently. Sure, in the aftermath, you can argue that one person's tweets were happening at the same time, right before, post the attack on the Capitol that happened. However, if you come out and you say, we do not stand for outright hate speech, calling for genocide, etc., and then that happens by the calling for the destruction of entire people group by a leader, and you have two sitting leaders, then to me that inconsistent application of the rubric means that I would be very, very troubled when we're allowing these people to apply that. Again, going back though to our earlier conversation about how they're private companies, they can do that. This is why I think that Section 230, like Austin mentioned earlier, needs to be fleshed out more and be less opaque, less vague when it's talking about other objectionable things as the last part of that clause, because it does leave them the ability to be so inconsistent. Final thoughts. We'll move on to hot takes. Any last things you guys want to say before the hot takes?
We've addressed a few times how big social media's become. That goes almost without saying. It's pretty much a given. I think one thing that people don't realize is that the internet is not some abstract thing floating out there in the ether. It's housed on servers. And approximately 33% of the internet is housed on Amazon Web Services. I don't know if y'all remember from last year before last. Can't remember the exact timeline, but I think one of Twitter's main competitors at the time, Parler, they're kind of up and coming as an alternative to Twitter. Amazon ousted
competitor is a strong term.
Okay, a very light competitor, only in the very technical sense. They were not much to speak of, but potential competitor, which honestly, that's kind of what we're looking for as far as potential solutions. If there was a little bit more choice on the market and less of a concentration of power, hopefully that would be a good thing as far as making sure everybody was able to have a voice. Amazon booted them off of pretty spurious claims. Now, that is Amazon's prerogative as the ones running the servers. But at the same time, how do we expect to ever have any competition in this space if seemingly, I'm going to assert, coordinated social media type things coming together to crush competition? I don't know. It smells like, I'm not going to say time for trust busting, but man, it really smells like a certain degree of coordination is going on that's preventing these spaces from having other competitors. I don't know. Really big problems.
Josh,
not to start hot takes, but
Nope. I am good. I'll have more spice for the hot takes.
All right. So why don't we put Marcelo last then? The non-existent ether Marcelo. So that would mean Josh, you start. Nope. That would be Austin, you go first, then Josh, then me, then Marcelo.
That works.
Yeah.
All right. We will be right back with our hot takes. And we're back. If you're watching us live, we never actually go anywhere. Magic. All right, Austin, take it away.
So we need to have like a thing where I can hide my face and I can pose as Marcelo and profess my support for Amazon and the big companies and Apple and, just kind of like put words in his mouth. No, just kidding. Y'all can look forward to Marcelo's hot takes after we get done with post. Regardless, I will start off my hot take with something I think we would all agree with, but is the hottest take of all. After you finish subscribing, liking, everything from Between the Liars, after you've gone through all of our content, turn your phone off, take your shoes off, go stand in the grass. In the words of a outdoors camp that I went to, in the words of one of the clinicians there, ground your electrons. It is time to get away from the social media for a little bit, clear your brain, and come back to reality the way it actually is, instead of pretending Twitter is the way the world actually is. Spend time with your family, spend time with your friends, even if it has to be through Zoom if you must. Talk to real people. Stop pretending like social media is real life. Go talk to someone as best as you can while dealing with COVID type things. Get back to reality, and that's the only way we're going to save this country. Now to the hottest takes. Again, I'll reiterate, it has been 25 years since Section 230 has been addressed. The internet is a vastly different place. And I think a lot of the issues that we're seeing will be mitigated if they will get specific with their laws. The nature of law is such that you need to be specific, otherwise people find loopholes, they can get around things. or we have these kind of issues metastasize over the course of 2.5 decades. It's a problem. I would love to see them get rid of the obscure, like anything that you find objectionable, essentially, thing at the end of 230. And honestly, I would like them to replace it with something holding these companies liable for their own rules. I think there's something to be said that the government could say, you said that you're going to enforce it this way. This person has recourse against you for that. I think there's something to that. And I mentioned it before, the hot takes as far as the lack of innovation in the space. And I think that kind of I can tie that back to right to repair. There is a certain degree where right to repair, some people might claim that it might infringe a little bit on the right of some companies to innovate. I don't particularly think that innovation of changing to a proprietary screw, I wouldn't call it innovation, not in the engineering sense or technological sense. I wouldn't say giving a cable that does the exact same thing as this other cable, but it only works with our tech. That's not innovation. So I don't really have a governmental fix for that, but companies, step your game up. Engineers, stop doing proprietary things for the sake of proprietary things. Make some new good technology. Do what you are called to do as an engineer. Do your job. Make something that's going to make people's lives easier. Do your job. Just do the thing.
Austin's hot takes: touch grass, do things. So on the right to repair, my hot take is obviously that we need to have more things like this. You can actually go to repair.org and it will take you through an overview of like what advocacy is being done, of what different states are doing, and how you can contribute to that cause, because I think it is a massive win for our environment, and it's a very ubiquitous win for the average consumer. So I'm always going to be repping that. On the issues when we come to social media, I think it's the impasse that we have no real say over what these social media companies do without the use of really heavy-handed, because even if we do get really specific, really intense detailing out like what's acceptable content, what's not acceptable content, even if it comes through Congress, that's still a philosophical, moral relinquishment of what is true and what is right to the government and to regulators. And that should not ever happen, regardless of how it is done through the government. No small group of people should ever be consigned with that power over truth and knowledge. It's bad enough that the philosophers terrorize us in the way that we like to. However, it has to be said, you don't have to accept the philosopher. The philosophers can go on and tell you what's right and wrong. How do we know things in epistemology and meta-ethics and normative ethics? However, you don't have to agree with it. The government can make you comply. And you don't want that. So, but we see the problem that the medieval peasants had with the feudal lords, and that what we have in Facebook now, and what we have with a lot of our global capital, massive companies. We don't have a say. We're not represented by them. They only care about their own interests. They have no actual care for the people they use. They use mindless algorithms to feed you content that has led to what has even infamously been now known as the YouTube to alt-right pipeline. There's been papers and essays and excellent coverage by the New York Times about stuff like this, about how echo chambers work and how they just keep feeding us. And it's senseless, and it's just means for profit's sake, with an apathetic nature towards humankind's development and our kind of discourse and our speech as we progress philosophically as a people. So at that level, again, grab your pitchforks, eat the rich. We need a say in corporations like this. It is not good when, even if we break up these companies into 20 different companies, it's not acceptable that 20 individuals, 20 CEOs be in charge of the largest platforms of discourse in our country. That's not a free and democratic society anymore. That's a society controlled by 20 oligarchs.
And on the note of echo chambers, I'd like to thank Mark Zuckerberg for allowing us to use Facebook as our platform for these hot takes. All right, so my hot takes. Number one, competition is important. That goes both ways for our earlier discussion about the right to repair laws, as well as for Section 230. The fastest way, in my opinion, to wind up killing the sources of information that people have or getting the best deal when it comes to replacing their products is by allowing monopolies and oligarchies to control what is taking place. That being said, it's also important when we call for congressional or governmental intervention that we do that very carefully, that we make sure that they are held to the specific bounds that they are granted through the enumerated power clause in the Constitution, and that they don't just turn social media into some form of an extended arm where we get that echo chamber of exactly what the party in power wants us to hear through Facebook. It's a double-edged sword that can cut both ways, and you have to use it with surgical precision, which is very difficult to do. My metaphor for the sword is working very well because you can't be surgical. So you have to be careful with how we call for that. In my opinion, this will probably be the hottest take I give. If you're in favor of censorship, downgrading of content that is contradictory to your beliefs, your political affiliations, etc., because it benefits you, then I would say that mindset, and in that case, you are a part of the problem. You have to think bigger picture before you call in for YouTube to say, for example, to be able to crack down on people who spread misinformation over things like COVID-19, etc. While that can be problematic, allowing them to censor that can be more problematic if it's not carefully done. And the last thing that I'll say is that big tech should not be holding the keys to information. It should not be up to a few heads of the Silicon Valley triarchy, or however many there are at this point, 4 or 5 companies. I know it's not a triarchy at the top, where they get to just decide what is truth and what is published, what is downgraded, etc. That needs to be broken up in some way, but done carefully. And tune in to our podcast when this airs in about 3 weeks with Marcelo's super secret extra hotter takes as we edit him in post-production. All right, I'm sure you find yourself somewhere between the liars. Join us next week, noon Central, for the start of our broadcast. Goodbye for now.
Marcelo's nuclear takes.